Captain Sarah Martinez had dreamed of flying military helicopters since she was 8 years old, watching them soar over her hometown near Fort Campbell. The daughter of a mechanic and a nurse, she worked double shifts throughout high school to save money for flight lessons. Her guidance counselor told her to be realistic about her career goals, suggesting nursing or teaching instead. Her father worried that the military was no place for his little girl. Even her best friend laughed when Sarah announced she would become a helicopter pilot. But Sarah refused to listen to the doubters. She studied aviation mechanics in her spare time, reading every manual she could find. She volunteered at the local airport, cleaning hangars and refueling planes just to be near aircraft. When she turned 18, she enlisted in the Army with one clear goal in mind. The recruitment officer tried to steer her toward administrative roles, claiming that combat positions were extremely competitive and physically demanding. Sarah politely declined every alternative suggestion. Basic training proved to be the first real test of her determination. While other recruits struggled with the physical demands, Sarah excelled. She woke up an hour earlier than required to do extra push-ups and run additional miles. Her drill sergeants initially viewed her with skepticism, making comments about whether she could handle the pressure when things got serious. Some fellow trainees whispered that she was trying too hard to prove something. Sarah ignored the whispers and focused on her performance. The flight school selection process was brutal. Out of 300 applicants, only 30 would be chosen for helicopter pilot training. Sarah scored in the top 5% on all written examinations. During the psychological evaluation, the interviewer questioned whether she had the emotional stability to make life or death decisions under extreme stress. He suggested that her determination might actually be a weakness, making her too rigid to adapt in crisis situations. When the acceptance letters arrived, Sarah's name was on the list. Her fellow selectees were mostly men from military families, many with fathers or brothers who had served as pilots. During their first week of flight school, instructors made it clear that not everyone would graduate. The washout rate was over 40%, and they warned that helicopter flying was unforgiving of mistakes. One instructor pulled Sarah aside after class, telling her that she would need to work twice as hard as everyone else to prove she belonged. The comment stung, but Sarah used it as fuel for her ambition. She spent evenings in the simulator when others relaxed in the barracks. She memorized emergency procedures until she could recite them perfectly under any conditions. When classmates went out on weekends, Sarah studied weather patterns and aircraft systems. Her dedication was obvious to everyone, but some instructors still seemed to question whether she had what it would take when faced with real combat situations. They would soon find out exactly what Sarah Martinez was made of. Flight training pushed Sarah to her absolute limits. The Black Hawk helicopter was a complex machine weighing 11,000 pounds, capable of carrying 11 fully equipped soldiers into combat zones. Learning to control such power required split-second timing and unwavering confidence. During her first solo flight, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration as she lifted off the ground. The instructor on the radio guided her through basic maneuvers, but she could hear doubt in his voice every time he gave corrections. Her classmates gradually began to respect her abilities, though some remained skeptical about her chances in actual combat situations. During formation flying exercises, Sarah consistently maintained perfect positioning, while others struggled to keep up. She mastered difficult techniques like auto-rotation landings and confined area operations weeks ahead of schedule. Yet when evaluation time came, instructors seemed to scrutinize her performance more carefully than others. One particularly challenging day involved night vision flying exercises. Sarah had to navigate through simulated enemy territory using only night vision goggles, avoiding imaginary anti-aircraft positions while delivering supplies to a forward operating base. The exercise was designed to test pilots under the most stressful conditions they might face in real combat. Sarah completed the mission flawlessly, but the evaluating officer noted in her file that she seemed overly cautious in her approach. The comment frustrated Sarah because she knew that being careful was actually a strength, not a weakness. Reckless pilots got people killed, while methodical ones brought everyone home safely. She tried to explain this perspective to her flight instructor, but he dismissed her concerns. He told her that combat flying required aggressive tactics and split-second decision-making, suggesting that her careful nature might be a liability in real situations. As graduation approached, Sarah's test scores ranked her third in the class, of 28 remaining students. She had mastered every required skill and exceeded standards in most categories. However, during her final evaluation meeting, the chief instructor expressed concerns about her ability to command respect from experienced crew members and ground troops. He questioned whether soldiers would trust orders from someone who looked like she could be their younger sister. The comments were deeply unfair, but Sarah maintained her professional composure. She had learned that arguing with superior officers only reinforced their negative opinions. Instead, she focused on proving herself through actions rather than words. Her assignment orders arrived 2 weeks later, directing her to Fort Bragg to join the 82nd Airborne Division. She would finally have the chance to show everyone exactly what she could accomplish when lives were on the line. The real test was just beginning. Fort Bragg was a completely different world from flight school. Sarah joined Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, where combat-hardened soldiers had little patience for untested pilots. Her crew chief, Sergeant Mike Thompson, had been flying combat missions for 8 years and made no effort to hide his skepticism about working with a rookie pilot, especially a female one. During their first meeting, he barely looked up from the maintenance checklist he was reviewing. The co-pilot assigned to Sarah's aircraft was Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a cocky young man fresh from advanced flight school who constantly talked about his father's distinguished military career. Jake made it clear that he expected to be promoted to aircraft commander ahead of Sarah, despite her superior test scores and training evaluations. He frequently questioned her decisions during pre-flight briefings, suggesting alternative approaches that he claimed were more aggressive and decisive. Sarah's first deployment was to Afghanistan, where her unit would provide transportation and medical evacuation support for ground troops conducting counterinsurgency operations. The mountainous terrain and unpredictable weather conditions made flying extremely dangerous, especially for inexperienced pilots. During the pre-deployment briefing, the battalion commander looked directly at Sarah when he emphasized that there was no room for hesitation or second-guessing in combat situations. Her first real mission involved transporting a squad of infantry soldiers to a remote outpost near the Pakistani border. The landing zone was barely large enough for the Black Hawk, surrounded by rocky terrain and potential enemy positions. As Sarah approached the landing site, Jake kept making nervous comments about the tight space and suggesting that she abort the landing. Sergeant Thompson remained silent in the back, but Sarah could feel his skeptical stare through her flight helmet. Sarah successfully completed the landing despite the challenging conditions, but she noticed that ground troops seemed surprised when they saw her climb out of the pilot's seat. Several soldiers made comments about having a female pilot, though they tried to keep their voices low. One sergeant approached Thompson privately, asking whether he was comfortable flying with such an inexperienced crew. The question hurt Sarah's feelings, but she pretended not to hear it. Over the following weeks, Sarah flew dozens of missions without incident. She transported troops, delivered supplies, and conducted medical evacuations with perfect efficiency. However, she noticed that other pilots received more challenging assignments while she was given routine transport missions. When she asked about flying combat support missions, her company commander told her that she needed more experience before taking on high-risk operations. Sarah suspected that gender bias played a role in these decisions, but she had no way to prove it. She would soon get an opportunity to demonstrate her capabilities in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. The emergency call came at 3 a.m. during a particularly quiet week in October. A special forces team had been ambushed during a reconnaissance mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains, leaving 2 soldiers critically wounded and trapped in hostile territory. The weather conditions were terrible, with heavy clouds, strong winds, and limited visibility that made flying extremely dangerous. 3 experienced pilots had already declined the mission, citing safety concerns and the low probability of success. Sarah was awakened by her company commander, who explained the desperate situation. The wounded soldiers would not survive until morning without immediate medical attention, but reaching their position would require flying through a narrow mountain valley in near-zero visibility conditions. The commander admitted that he was hesitant to send such an inexperienced pilot on such a dangerous mission, but other aircraft were either under maintenance or already committed to different operations. Jake Morrison immediately volunteered to take command of the aircraft, arguing that his recent training in advanced combat tactics made him better qualified to handle the dangerous mission. He pointed out that Sarah had never flown a combat rescue operation under such extreme conditions. Several other pilots agreed with Jake's assessment, suggesting that Sarah should serve as co-pilot while someone with more experience took the controls. Sarah respectfully disagreed with their assessment. She had studied the mountain terrain extensively and had flown through that particular valley twice during daylight hours. More importantly, she had spent countless hours practicing instrument flying techniques that would be essential for navigating in poor visibility conditions. Her careful, methodical approach to flying would be an advantage rather than a liability in such dangerous circumstances. The debate continued for several precious minutes while the wounded soldiers waited for rescue. Sarah could see doubt in everyone's faces as they considered whether to trust such an important mission to an untested pilot. The company commander finally made the decision to let Sarah fly the mission, but he assigned Jake as co-pilot with instructions to take control if the situation became too dangerous. As Sarah began pre-flight preparations, Sergeant Thompson approached her with a serious expression. He told her that he had initially been skeptical about working with a female pilot, but her consistent professionalism had earned his respect over the past few months. However, he warned her that this mission would be unlike anything she had ever attempted, and that many experienced pilots had died attempting similar rescues in bad weather conditions. Sarah appreciated his honesty and promised that she would not take any unnecessary risks with the lives of her crew or the wounded soldiers. She had trained for exactly this type of situation throughout her entire career, and she was confident in her abilities despite what others might think. As she started the Black Hawk's engines, Sarah knew that the next few hours would determine whether she would finally earn the respect of her colleagues or prove their doubts correct. The Black Hawk lifted off into complete darkness, with visibility so poor that Sarah could barely see 50 feet ahead of the aircraft. She relied entirely on her instruments to navigate through the treacherous mountain terrain, using every technique she had learned during countless hours of simulated instrument flying. Jake sat tensely in the co-pilot seat, constantly checking their position and altitude while making nervous comments about the dangerous conditions. As they flew deeper into the mountains, the weather conditions grew worse. Strong crosswinds buffeted the helicopter, making it difficult to maintain steady flight. Sarah had to constantly adjust her controls to compensate for sudden gusts that threatened to slam the aircraft into rocky cliff faces. Through her night vision goggles, she could occasionally glimpse jagged peaks emerging from the clouds like ghostly sentinels guarding the valley. Sergeant Thompson provided regular updates from the back of the aircraft, monitoring radio communications with the trapped Special Forces team. The wounded soldiers were growing weaker with each passing minute, and their teammates were running low on ammunition while fending off sporadic enemy attacks. Time was running out, but Sarah refused to rush her approach and risk crashing in the mountains. Jake became increasingly agitated as they approached the target area, repeatedly suggesting that Sarah was flying too slowly and cautiously. He argued that aggressive flying was necessary to reach the soldiers quickly, and he offered several times to take control of the aircraft. Sarah politely declined his suggestions while maintaining her methodical approach to the dangerous mission. She knew that one mistake at this altitude and in these conditions would be fatal for everyone involved. When they finally reached the coordinates provided by the ground team, Sarah discovered that the landing zone was even more challenging than expected. The Special Forces soldiers were trapped on a narrow ledge barely wide enough for the Black Hawk, with enemy positions on the surrounding hills. The approach required flying between two mountain peaks with less than 20 feet of clearance on each side of the rotor blades. Sarah began a careful descent toward the landing zone, using every ounce of skill and concentration she possessed. Jake gripped his controls tightly, ready to take over if Sarah made any mistakes. Through the intercom, she could hear the tension in everyone's voices as they watched her thread the massive helicopter through an impossibly narrow gap. The slightest, Miscalculation would send them crashing into solid rock. As Sarah flared for landing, a sudden gust of wind pushed the Black Hawk sideways toward the cliff face. For a terrifying moment, it seemed certain that they would crash. But Sarah's quick reflexes and countless hours of practice saved them, as she expertly corrected the aircraft's position and settled gently onto the rocky ledge. Even Jake had to admit that the landing was absolutely perfect under such impossible conditions. The rescue operation had to be completed quickly, as enemy forces were regrouping for another attack on the trapped soldiers. Sergeant Thompson and the crew medic rushed to load the wounded men into the aircraft while the Special Forces team provided covering fire from defensive positions around the landing zone. Sarah kept the engines running and maintained precise control of the Black Hawk despite the strong winds that continued to buffet the aircraft. As the last wounded soldier was secured in the cabin, enemy gunfire erupted from positions higher up, on the mountainside. Bullets sparked off the rocky ground around the helicopter, and Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of high-powered rifles echoing through the valley. She had to take off immediately before the enemy could adjust their aim and target the aircraft directly. The takeoff proved even more challenging than the landing, as Sarah had to gain altitude quickly while navigating between the same narrow mountain peaks. With the additional weight of passengers and in deteriorating weather conditions, the Black Hawk responded sluggishly to her control inputs. Jake shouted warnings about their proximity to the cliff faces, but Sarah remained calm and focused on her flying. During the flight back to base, one of the wounded soldiers went into cardiac arrest. The crew medic worked frantically to stabilize him while Sarah pushed the Black Hawk to its maximum speed without compromising safety. She had to balance the urgent need for medical treatment against the continuing dangerous weather conditions that made flying at high speed extremely risky. As they approached the base hospital, Sarah executed a perfect approach and landing, despite the swirling winds and poor visibility. Medical teams rushed to meet the aircraft and immediately transported both wounded soldiers to the trauma center. Both men survived their injuries and made full recoveries, thanks largely to Sarah's skilled flying under impossible conditions. Word of the successful rescue mission spread quickly throughout the base. The company commander publicly praised Sarah's exceptional performance, admitting that he had initially doubted whether she could handle such a dangerous operation. Jake Morrison approached her privately to apologize for questioning her abilities, and to acknowledge that her methodical approach had been exactly what the mission required. Sergeant Thompson told anyone who would listen that Sarah was the finest pilot he had ever worked with. Sarah's reputation was permanently transformed by that single night in the mountains. She received the Distinguished Flying Cross for her heroic actions and was promoted ahead of schedule to aircraft commander. More importantly, she had finally proven to herself and everyone else that determination and skill matter more than gender or appearance. The girl who had been told to be realistic about her dreams had brought everyone home safely when it mattered most. Her words had been dismissed by many, but her actions spoke louder than any criticism ever could.